Welcome to the Progression Health Podcast. I'm here with Peter Tierney. Peter, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for inviting me, Ross. I am a sports scientist, a performance coach and researcher, and I've worked over the last number of years across like a wide variety of different sort of organizations and sports. A lot of that time was in rugby and in football or soccer for the North American listeners, but also amongst like endurance sports or triathletes and also some Olympic lifting and just a wide variety of sports across that time. I also spent a couple of years working in Lululemon as a researcher in their innovation team. So quite a different role, but also a lot of like similarities and crossover between, what people might consider a traditional or a sports scientist or performance scientist and somebody working in that innovation space as well. So all of that, I guess, culminated into me deciding to do mostly consulting and contracts, a variety of different people, athletes, brands and companies in and around the sort of health and performance space.
Amazing. Yeah, I was just looking at your LinkedIn before this. You have an amazing amount of experience and really excited to have this conversation. And yeah, just in terms of being a sports scientist, it's like a little bit broad. So yeah, what is your specialty? What's your niche? What do you love getting into?
Yeah, I think sports science should be relatively broad because I think that's the nature of the role, but you'll definitely hear different definitions of it. And in some team sports organizations, a sports scientist will be the person who is completely responsible for data collection and will do little else outside of that. In other places, the title is sports scientist, but their role is a data analyst or data scientist. And so I think for me, it's mostly about, and someone else actually gave me this sort of like way of thinking or definition for myself, was you sort of act, and this is how I have always acted, as like a dot connector, or what I would say is like a hybrid role. So the reason I say sports scientist and performance coach is that I've always coached alongside the sort of sports science or research elements. I think that's important because you get the practical understanding as well as the sort of scientific understanding as well.
Yeah, I think that's the best kind of coach is someone who, as you posted, you've done the Dublin Marathon and you practice yourself, but you've also got the academic background. So yeah, in terms of connecting the dots, like that's an interesting way to put it. What are kind of like some typical connections you make, or like what are people typically struggling with that when you come in, you can kind of connect those dots for them?
Yeah. Honestly, the thing that people struggle most with is just connecting the dots. So, particularly now how people digest information and learn online, they see lots of like snippets, and that's not to say that these snippets are wrong. Some of them are, some of them can be, so try get that from credible sources if you're learning about sleep and training and running and nutrition. But often people will learn and see snippets, okay, fueling this way or using these recovery strategies, sleeping this much, training. They'll see different training sessions, or a really easy example to think about is they'll see these really interesting looking gym exercises and they'll think, okay, that looks great. This person's athletic. They're performing really well. I should be doing that exercise. And what I mean by connecting the dots is like, okay, well, how do you integrate an exercise like that? Is it necessary? What does it mean? How do you measure it? And how does it fit into like your overall goals? And like, is it the most important thing to focus on at the moment versus all of the other pieces of the performance puzzle?
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of, I just had like a quick chat with an Uber driver here, and he was like, I only go to the gym once a week or maybe sometimes twice. And I'm like, man, you're absolutely crushing it. Like, he's like a dad as well. And, to be going to the gym, I think it puts you in like the upper quarter of adults in the US. And if you can get to the gym twice a week, then you're way up into that quartile. And I was just like, the amount you have to do, it's kind of skewed. So do you think, impact do you think social media has on people's perception of like health and what they should be doing and like, what is required to, I guess, just be healthy nowadays?
It definitely skews it because, and the example, I think even for marathon, and I won't get the exact numbers correct, but I feel like in conversation with people who are doing marathons or even just friends who don't, but it just, keep an eye on, say, if I'm running or other friends are running, people's perception of what is an above average time in a marathon or like fast, is so skewed from what reality is. And I feel like even people think of, you're not actually above average unless you're running like a sub 3 hour marathon. But the average time across, all of the world major marathons and even non-major marathons for men, for example, I think is 3 hours 45 minutes, 3 hours 50 as an average time. And that's not even accounting for people that don't run the marathons. And I think that's probably what social media has skewed. So again, the information on social media isn't incorrect, but it's certainly a sliver of, of a proportion of people. And you probably assume up until this point, and I hope this changes, but people who are slightly faster are more willing to share their times, and people see that versus seeing other times. So one, I hope that everyone in that specific instance, everyone should feel comfortable sharing whatever time they achieve, because it's amazing that if, in a marathon example, if you do a marathon, it's amazing. It doesn't matter what time you do it in, but certainly to help with the overall picture of, if someone runs a 4-hour marathon, that's still an amazing time. And you can't really compare that to, some of the top 1% of the people who are posting on social media. So that is definitely an example. It's a challenge because, I'll get questions and I get things sent to me on social media, and I'm saying like, you don't have to worry about this. Like that's get the rest of everything else sorted first, and, a fraction of what you should be focusing on.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like, I'd say to do maybe even like a half, for example, is probably where you're like above average. Just if you were to draw a line through the population, or maybe even like a 5K, but to do a marathon is like, it's 26 miles. It's like 4 hours, 3 hours of running. It's a lot. And yeah, going back to that question people ask you, is there any kind of typical questions that people are just DMing you, like, or, emailing you about like, hey, like this is what I'm struggling with, and there's commonalities there?
Yeah, I do get quite a bit around, like wearables definitely come up a lot around like a lot of the data. And one of the situations that always comes up is that the data doesn't reflect how that person feels, and is the data wrong, or what's happening. And that's a situation that I've had to navigate with quite a few people. Another one, I guess somewhat linked to that, is sort of people asking about like what recovery strategy is best, or tool, or whatever it is. And I always try to remind people that, like, there are all these tools exist for a reason, because they are effective at specific things at specific times. But how you recover from one thing or session or one period might be very different to how you recover at a different phase of your running season or team sport preseason or whatever it might be. So I'm always trying to remind people of like to step back a little bit from all of the things, whereas like, again, the nature of some of the social media pieces is that everybody sort of like gets caught up in the small things. So the theme, I guess, is consistent in that, yeah, people get lost a little bit, like the numbers or the small details, and then I try and encourage them to take a step back from a lot of it. And I think that helps clarify. If you step back and think about it, then you can make a decision about the smaller pieces.
Yeah, it's absolutely overwhelming. Like, you could have a Whoop on one arm, you could have an Oura Ring, you could have an Apple or Garmin on, and you'd have the phone. I just realized yesterday that my phone is tracking my steps, even though I didn't even have the health app. Like, I deleted it. So yeah, you can just get overwhelmed. So like, could you give a scenario where the wearable would dictate how you advise someone to modify their training for a given day or a given week? So, oftentimes I'll look at my watch and I'll say like, okay, I did a run yesterday. I run a lot, and it's like, you need X amount of recovery, but I'm like, I have a run planned, and it's sort of just like, it's almost like a case of I ignore it or I follow it to a T. It's hard to get a kind of a middle ground. So yeah, would you just give a scenario of how it can be used to guide training in a given time period?
I'll also, I guess, focus on a specific metric first, but with wearables, for the most part, your data should be relatively consistent or within a normal range for you. So take any metric within that principle. So if that's sleep duration, so you should sleep normally within, around an average of 7 hours, for example. And use resting heart rate in that example. So if your average resting heart rate is 50 or 60 beats per minute, it should be plus or minus that for the most part, HRV, etc. And one of the guiding principles that I recommend to people is that if you start to see big changes in any of those data points, and also obviously if the changes occur across multiple different metrics, that's a situation where I would definitely consider changing something, particularly if it's unexpected. So a situation where I wouldn't is if you do a hard day of exercise or training today. So if that's like a threshold session for a runner and a heavy gym sessions, or double day maybe, for example, like I would expect to see, because you've stressed your system in a way, I would expect to see slight changes in your maybe overnight physiology. So for example, your resting heart rate might increase a little bit, your heart rate variability might decrease a little bit. And those changes, if I see those tomorrow, are expected. And hopefully my plan is appropriate, that I have accounted for that. So tomorrow is an easier day, and I train accordingly. Now, if for example, I have done an easy day of exercise today, a light jog or whatever, basic strength session, I shouldn't see too much change in my physiology. But if I do see that tomorrow, that's maybe a sign to me that, okay, the session or the stress or strain on my system yesterday actually took a bit more out of me than I expected. And I'll give you an example, I guess, as well, just even today myself. So you probably hear my voice. I'm not sick, but I'm in London in the UK. So if somebody gets sick, the whole city gets sick because everyone is just so tightly packed. It's like any big major city. It's impossible to avoid. And for the most part, because I consider, I eat a good diet and I'm relatively fit and healthy, I can fight off most of them. And this is where I think wearables can come into play to support people, because yesterday I had some very small symptoms around my throat, and then this morning and yesterday I had a slightly elevated temperature off of my wearable device. And that's not such a big change that I'm going to, do nothing today, but certainly I have reduced my training intensity yesterday and today because I don't want to dig a hole that gets me too deep that I become extremely sick. Whereas now I can function, I can work, I can still exercise a little bit. And so that's a situation, like even just a real life example where temperature, for example, as a metric is used alongside some of my sort of like awareness of very, very mild symptoms to help manage today and tomorrow without saying kind of like, do nothing today or completely ignore the wearable data. Well, actually there's good evidence there and good practice to make some small tweaks so that hopefully by tomorrow and over the weekend that I'm in a place where I'm kind of back to normal again.
Yeah, it's like, I think being flexible is a key skill. And, you might have a hard day, an easy day. You could do a full rest day. You could do extra sleep. There's a lot of different things. Would you suggest someone, or do you do this yourself, where you have like a range of different approaches you might take based on a given day? Sleeping more, napping, less coffee, more coffee, vitamin C or extra supplements. Like what kind of different things would you do based on, let's just assume a person is fatigued, or take yourself, for example. Specifically, how are you going to make an adjustment?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's how I think about recovery, or just even general like health. There's always those core basics or pillars that you have to maintain, hopefully as many days as possible through the year. That's like sleeping sufficiently, eating well enough, protein, carbohydrate need, micronutrients, and staying hydrated. They're the sort of like forevers. And hopefully then you add in exercising consistently. That will obviously change depending on training goals and everything else. And then on top of that, I do think there's an element of like decision making that's, I say this is both effective and efficient. And this is maybe around specifically around recovery, but I think it applies to training as well. So the recovery example I can give is easy because I've shared this a lot of socials, is around like the SHIT recovery framework. So it's like an acronym that just helps people make a decision around what recovery strategy might be most effective and efficient for the symptoms that they're feeling. But the premise is you can apply to illness or training as well. And the SHIT stands for SHIT, stands for stiff, heavy, irritable, and tired. The principle that I have is that, a recovery strategy, if you feel tired, shouldn't be the same as if you feel stiff or heavy, because that doesn't make physiological sense. But it also just it's completely inefficient and potentially ineffective as well. And also the idea of this sort of decision-making framework is to put a little bit of ownership onto like the individual as an athlete. Instead of trying to squeeze every single recovery strategy possible into a session or a day, which takes time and also probably adds a little bit of load onto that person already. It's like, okay, well, pick the one or two that are most effective depending on the symptoms or the sensations that you're feeling in that moment. And so that's like one example of recovery. But for training in particular, again, same principle. I would say if I program for anybody, I will always give like a range of sets and or reps. And this goes for running, but it also goes for like strength and power work as well. And what I'm doing there is trying to give the person or the athlete a little bit of, I guess, like auto-regulation or self-regulation, so that, if you come in tomorrow morning into the gym or for a running session, I'm going to give you a range of sets and reps. But, if you feel great and all of your wearable data suggests that everything's leading in the right direction, well, then maybe for your running, do it a few seconds faster per kilometer, per mile. In the gym, if you want to do slightly heavier, that's fine. It's still within, somewhat of a constraint of like, I'm trying to guide this, this person to across a longer term program. But within that day, that's fine. On the flip side of that, if someone's someone's feeling a bit stiffer or heavier, maybe you reduce the intensity in some of the intervals, or maybe you just, there's a period of time where, and I'm sure you'll have experienced this as every runner does, where, at the start of a workout, you feel stiffer and then you get into it and you go, actually, do you know what? I feel like pretty good. And I think that's almost a bit of guidance I'd give as well, is like, get moving, get warm, but also like address the problem you have. So there's some of those sessions where I feel stiff in the morning. Okay, well, you've got 15 minutes before you go for a run, do some mobility, for example, that will help reduce stiffness, apply some heat, and then see if you can fulfill the program like as prescribed. So there's a few different, it's almost like putting the responsibility still on me as a coach or you as a coach, but you're trying to educate a person or an athlete so that they can make decisions and take ownership over what is best for them on that given day.
Yeah, absolutely. Because a client is going to do what they want to do anyways, we can make the best recommendations, but so advocating for their own, ability to do that extra warm up, things like that will have a huge impact. So just with the wearables, is there any kind of and actually heart rate variability as well, because that's, a big part of wearables, or I would hope that people have heart rate variability on whatever wearable they have. Yeah. What is heart rate variability? And then is it the most important predictor of recovery, like I have heard, or how do you look at how well someone is recovered? Let's say, for example, someone has a hard training session ahead and they want to know how hard to go. Do they go 9 out of 10? Do they go 8 out of 10? Do they keep it around a 6? Kind of recovery metrics are they looking at, if it's heart rate variability or something else?
Yeah, heart rate variability is an important metric. I think, it can be slightly misinterpreted because of maybe social media or even just different marketing and stuff. So heart rate variability is like it's a measure of the time between successive heartbeats, and the evidence suggests that the larger that difference is, the more variance in that time, the system is more in like a parasympathetic state, so it's more relaxed or able to tolerate and handle stress. That's the sort of premise of the metric. Now, the difference between current wearables and most of the research that's happened before a lot of these wearables have become commercialized is that most of the evidence around heart rate variability training and feedback is actually using a morning reading of heart rate variability. So not taking an overnight reading. And that's important because there's some good heart rate variability specific researchers who I learn a lot from. Two guys, particularly Marco Tierney and Andrew Flatt. So I learned a lot from those guys, and they would definitely be the experts to go deep into this if you do want to speak to them, or if someone's listening and wants to follow and read a bit more on their work. But a lot of their work is showing that whilst the overnight readings and the morning readings can be related, they can also differ slightly. And sometimes the morning readings are a little bit more sensitive to make decisions around training based off of. So that's one caveat just to put into this. Now, I do still think the overnight readings are accurate and they still hold value 100%. So I don't want to diminish the value of those, but just to acknowledge that a big body of work is still happening, it has happened, is taking a heart rate variability reading in the morning. The other piece to acknowledge is that a lower or more normal and even a lower heart rate variability reading doesn't mean that you can't perform to a high level. And often what you'll see in the research is that you'll actually see heart rate variability suppressed the morning of a competition, and so a lower heart rate variability. Now, if you look at that on a typical wearable score, readiness, recovery, whatever it is, that will probably get marked down. So it might show you that you're 60 or 50 or something like that out of 100. But in actual fact, that's just your system getting excited and maybe a little bit nervous for the competition you have. And there's plenty of evidence to support people with a lower heart rate variability can perform on that day. Now, if that happens every day and consecutive days and training and adaptation, that's a different conversation. And in that situation, a lower heart rate variability might suggest that you maybe just need a little bit more time to recover after an intense workout. So I guess the main message I want to share is just because a wearable shows a slightly depressed or lower heart rate variability, you shouldn't be scared to go out and do a really tough workout today. And you definitely shouldn't be afraid that it's going to influence or impact your performance on race day, because it definitely isn't. And some wearables actually, and Whoop is very good for this, you can actually hide some of the recovery scores for an indefinite period of time. But if I was someone, if someone gets nervous about these scores, I would actually suggest to them, particularly in a race or competition, or if they're a team sport athlete, a footballer, they want to, they would still want to collect the data because it's definitely still useful. I think I'd almost recommend them for a few days leading into a competition to switch that off. off. Now, for me, I've tested so many of these devices that like I don't need to do that, because there's at times that have 5 or 6 on at the same time, and you learn to move on from looking at numbers pretty quickly. Sometimes I just sync them and I don't even look at it until later in the day. But sorry, that's a very long answer around heart rate variability, but I guess it probably highlights as well just some of the nuance around it, and why it is important, hopefully, people to just like listen and like ask some questions of like I said, of Marco and Andrew, two experts, because it's another example of like, you know, some of the things you see on social media and trying to educate people in a short form way misses out on some of that nuance.
And yeah, also you have to individualize it and take it in context. Like one number doesn't make or break the full training cycle you're in. So this is kind of my understanding. Let me have a stab at it and you tell me, what you think. But, the kind of healthy range for a heart rate is like 60 to 100 beats at rest. But I would say if you're under 60, that's the kind of the ideal you want it to be. And the same is true of heart rate variability. So, the opposite is true of heart rate variability. So the range is 60 to 100 that you're looking to be in. And if you can be 60 or above, great. But with heart rate variability, I rarely, if ever, see anyone average 60 or above, like over a 7-day period. So I guess just to throw out some numbers for heart rate, what do you think is like a good aim for people's heart rate? I know it's not really that controllable, like, kind of like your body weight, you can't just change it overnight. But what's a healthy resting heart rate, and then also heart rate variability score?
Yeah. So heart rate variability first, and then I'll go to resting heart rate. It definitely is not as clear, and it's linked to the points I mentioned around a lot of the research on heart rate variability and mortality risk being done previously on morning readings or like one-off readings. And typically they will be, again, not always, but typically they will be higher than an average across the whole night. That makes sense. You're taking a shorter reading, it'll be higher, and not always. But so the ranges for those are definitely less clear cut in terms of like being above a certain threshold of 60 milliseconds versus being below it. I do think if it's something chronically low, below 20, 25 milliseconds on a wearable, I think that's probably some indicator of like chronic stress, and that would be a point where I would be certainly looking at other factors. And I do think if someone's heart rate variability is that low, there are probably other obvious metrics and measures that are also suggestive of that type of state. But it definitely isn't as clear in terms of, if someone's heart rate variability is 50 milliseconds. That doesn't mean that they're at greater risk of, mortality or cardiovascular disease or anything of someone who's 70. And that's where this individual range is probably most important. You can alter your heart rate variability with really good behaviors and things, but I think for the most part, and Marco Tierney sort of has this mindset as well, is that normal is good. A little bit higher than that is maybe good. Too high can probably be an indicator of something stressing your system as well, because your body's trying to fight it. And too low outside of your normal range is maybe a negative, but normal is good. And I would almost suggest to some people that on those kind of color green, amber, red scores, that normal should be green, not high, because normal is an indicator that your system is operating sufficiently and normally. So I think that's enough for like heart rate variability. Resting heart rate though is different, and I do think the evidence suggests that there's a pretty linear increase or decrease in mortality risk and related to fitness and everything else, that the lower the better. Now, when you I've seen some people online trying to get like a resting heart rate below 30 or 30 beats per minute or something. And I think there's always people that will push to the extremes. And, in every extreme there's probably limitations and reservations that I've had around that. But typically the increase is linear, and the medical advice is for such a broad range, like 60 to 100 beats per minute for resting heart rate, in my opinion, is like too big. And I do think, I understand why government guidelines have to be broad because of like specifics. But if I saw a resting heart rate of 90 beats per minute, again, that would be concerning to me. And I would be telling somebody to go to see their GP. And also I would be making some like really, really big changes around like health behaviors, nutrition, activity. And like I said, I think if someone's resting heart rate is that high, I think there are other obvious like indicators around health. So I would like to see some governments with more tech and data start to be a little bit more like dialed in terms of resting heart rates, because I just don't think there's a clinician in the world who sees a resting heart rate of 90 and goes, yeah, you're in perfect health, like go home. I just don't think that's the case. So yeah, I think there's a stat, and I don't want to butcher this so I need to check it, but I believe I did read a paper recently, and every 10 beat per minute increase in resting heart rate results in like a 16% increase in mortality risk. So as you start to increase, now obviously that's not true across the entire spectrum of data, but it's pretty linear. So that is probably the metric that I wouldn't say focus on the most, but I think it's a combination of it has such strong evidence for its use case. It is also really reliable. And even with some sensors that, maybe are not 100% accurate for heart rate variability, resting heart rate for most tech devices is valid. And so that tends to be the one that, if you see changes in resting heart rate that are significantly increased from your normal, I think it's a pretty clear-cut sign that your body's under stress or your system is under stress.
And in terms of like having a wearable versus like not having a wearable, let's say somebody's like, okay, now's the time I'm going to improve my health, haven't been really looking at, any health metrics at all, not even steps, for example. Do you think, in the current time that we're in, a wearable of like any kind, because there's, you mentioned you wore 6 at one point, is a wearable essential?
It's a great question. And like in reality, it's not essential. And, there are a lot of people that I know who don't use wearables to track overnight stuff. I have some friends who run using a smartwatch, but don't wear anything overnight. And so are they healthy? Yeah, I think they are. Their performance in a running event would tell me that they have a high VO2 max. They resistance train twice a week, so their lean mass is high. They have a low body fat percent, or I don't say excessively low, but they have a normal body fat percentage. They eat reasonably well. So for those people, I'm saying, there's probably no need. So it's not essential. But I do think in the current world, it's so accessible. Obviously some are expensive, but there are some very accessible options from a price perspective. So I'm conscious, obviously, I don't know everyone's financial situation, so it's easy for people who have lots of money to spend on different wearables, but there are some cheap options. But also the analogy I use to people is, wearables are like Google Maps. And I think a few years ago, even you think about a smartphone, people are like, that's not essential, but it kind of is now, isn't it? But if you think of wearables like a Google Maps, you still need to like set your own goals, and you still need to do something. Like the wearable just measures information. It doesn't improve your sleep. The behaviors associated with the data improve your sleep. The behaviors associated with seeing low activity improve your activity levels, not the actual wearable. But if I was going somewhere, traveling, driving, commuting, like getting public transport, I would usually search the route in Google Maps or City Map or Apple Maps, whatever it is you use. And even if I know the route really well, even if it's a commute that I do every week, because how am I supposed to know what if there's traffic, or there's works on the underground, or there's been an accident somewhere on the road if I'm cycling, or they've closed something for works. And only using technology will help me identify the most efficient route to where I want to go to. And so the technology is the same thing. It's, you still need to decide where you want to go. You still have to do like the commute or the action or the journey there, but the data can help navigate the most efficient path there. And so the example being, if maybe I don't have symptoms. This happened to me during COVID. My wearable data flagged an increased breathing rate and temperature. I had no symptoms, but the next morning I woke up and saw that. I said, oh, that's like pretty alarming. It's such a big change. Okay, I'm not going to exercise today because that's telling me something. And, at the time, if I was to see a relative who was older or more at risk, that would have prompted me to say, look, I've seen a little bit of a change in this, like I might be developing it. And lo and behold, a day later, I had symptoms and my heart rate was elevated and I had COVID. So without the technology, I may have done something on that day that might have, again, like I said, dug myself a hole too deep in terms of illness. So yeah, to go back to your question, like it's not essential, but I do think like a lot of the data, particularly with how people are becoming definitely more data literate across like not just wearables or health, just in general, I do think it's really valuable to have that level of like objectivity and I guess in some way like accountability. And in my opinion, the true value of these wearables is collecting the data over like a longer period of time. So, people get them and change them and get rid of them. I just think if you can have data for 10, 15 years, that is going to be so powerful, more so than having it for 10 weeks.
Yeah, over the long term, we get way better trends and we can make way better judgments. So that's a great point. So you've mentioned body temperature a little bit, and it's something that I haven't looked into or even tracked myself. So like, how important is body temperature on a wearable? And then like, what would it be able to tell us, or what changes would you make based on body temperature?
Yeah, so body temperature, two main reasons. One is around illness. And so typically you'll see, and sorry, when I'm referring to the temperature in wearables, for the most part, they're referring to like changes in temperature. So they collect a sort of a baseline of temperature. And then if it increases or decreases, it'll show you like plus 1 degree Celsius, or probably plus like 0.5 degrees Celsius. And you can do the Fahrenheit conversion quicker than I can at the moment. But that's one piece. And then the other piece is around menstrual tracking for females. So they're the two main use cases for temperature. And I think particularly for the illness piece, it's really sensitive, as in if you see an increased temperature, it is usually indicative that you are fighting like a cold and flu, maybe like food poisoning or any sort of illness, because it's such a strong indicator. And then around menstrual tracking, it can definitely help females in that regard. In terms of it, the pattern is typically pretty consistent across a full cycle. So they'd be the two main use cases. I wouldn't expect to see huge changes day to day, in response to training, unless you did like a really, really difficult and intense session close to bed. You might see a slightly elevated temperature just from that intense workout. But it's one of those metrics that I think is like I said, you may not make any decisions from it for a few weeks or a few months. And then when you see a big change, particularly a consecutive, 2 days of a change, it's one that I would listen to, I think.
Got it. Yeah. So one day is not a big change, but over a couple of days we get more info. So yeah, don't be too knee jerk. So I'm preparing for a marathon. You've just done one. A lot of people are getting into running nowadays. What's the biggest recovery mistake that you see athletes make in the build up to a marathon? Because, it's that crucial time where you're trying to taper, but you're also trying to get that final long run in. So yeah, what's the biggest recovery mistake that athletes make in the lead up to a marathon?
Yeah, I think it is, it's linked to probably something I mentioned earlier on, is like people trying to do too much. Particularly in the few weeks leading up to a marathon, you've got to remember that like recovery is trying to balance the stress or the strain that you're under. And when people start doing, every single recovery modality that exists in their gym or in their garage or like the tools they have access to, they might add a little bit of stress to their system. And I think most of the work, particularly for marathon, is done before the final 3 or 4 weeks. And so if I was focused on recovery in the lead into a marathon, I just would try to stay consistent with training, stick to the plan you have. If anything, like eat a little bit more to make sure you're recovered, sleep a little bit more if you can. So, if you had a little bit of extra time, I would almost add it on to sleep. And then also like use some sort of decision-making framework that, okay, if you do feel particularly sore or tired or whatever it is, just use the specific recovery strategy that supports that sensation.
Yeah, it's funny about how many different things you can do, like a massage or, hot, cold, all these different things. It's like you could spend more time doing recovery than you could actually doing the training. But with my build, I find in the last couple of weeks, I know that it's meant to feel uncomfortable and I'm just meant to feel like shit, basically. And I'm prepared for that. But also, it's like, how would somebody know preparing for a marathon that they've gone overboard, they're pushing too hard? What's a way to gauge that?
Yeah, I think this is quite individual. So one thing I'll say to people is, if it's your first or second marathon, you're going to learn a few things about yourself and what works for like you as an individual. And even as a coach, you can base what you're prescribing based off of like the knowledge we have from the science, from elite runners, from other coaches, from other people you've coached. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be some specifics that are, oh yeah, Ross, you like this type of taper versus somebody else, or depending on your mileage. If your mileage isn't too high, you maybe don't have too much mileage to actually taper. So it's different for elite runners. Going from 200 kilometers to 120 kilometers is a massive drop, but if you're running 30 kilometers a week, you don't have much volume to actually taper. So it's always going to be individual. But I think if you start to see like big changes in things, like big changes in body weight or excessive fatigue, like accumulative fatigue. Like I think everyone will appreciate you're usually reasonably consistently tired across a marathon training block, particularly in those like peak weeks, and as you said, kind of coming towards the tail end of the block. So that could, like some of those things, I would listen to a combination of your sensation but also your wearable data. And this is a situation where I think some of the data from technology can be supportive, because you might feel tired, which is probably just expected at the phase of your program that you're in. And I think almost you can maybe even talk yourself out of doing, your prescribed run for today. But I think some of the wearable data, if it supports it, if your heart rate is normal, your heart rate variability is normal, you've slept 7-8 hours, your temperatures, and all of those factors are normal, I think you've got to take some confidence to go, do you know what? Like, I feel a little bit tired, but like my system is obviously responding well to my program and the stimulus. So I've just got to stick with the program. And that's a case where I think, yeah, you can use those. People say like, you shouldn't rely on it, but I do think it's useful in that type of situation. I think if you're experiencing, big swings in physiology and sleep and energy and mood, something like a circuit breaker type of situation can be useful. So if you're, how many weeks out are you from your marathon at the moment?
You're putting me on the spot now. 2.5.
What is it? 2.5. Okay, so yeah, maybe it's close enough. But if you were, excessively tired tomorrow, you're sleeping terribly, I would almost say like a little circuit breaker of like even a day and a half of like just full rest can often be enough to sort of like rebound somebody back into feeling a little bit better and stuff. So that can be one like strategy. Obviously, like I said, depends on the person, but that can be something that you can do if you see those, basically if you see massive swings and changes in all those things: mood, energy, soreness, sleep, physiology, and particularly if they're unexpected. Yeah,
the big shifts are kind of scary, and the small needle movers, like yesterday my heart rate went from it increased 3 beats yesterday morning, and I was like, oh, here we go now, something's coming on, and then it's back to normal today. So yeah, you gotta think, to your point, look over the long term. So a marathon's very difficult, and maybe people are hopefully preparing for other events outside of a marathon, but with the marathon in mind, what's one meaningful like race day habit that people could prepare in advance? So like, this can be like a mindset shift they can make, or recovery based, or even just like, you mentioned warming up. What's one thing that would help them on race day to be more resilient for the challenge that's coming up?
I just think it's a fueling like focus for me, like the 2 days before marathon, because you'll have developed all of your fitness before then. So there's nothing physically you can change in the 48 hours before a race. You can do a shakeout, you can do a couple of strides, you can feel a little bit better, but you're not going to actually get any fitter or faster in the day or two before. But certainly you can knock a lot of time off, or you can add a lot of time to your marathon if you don't fuel properly. So I would really get people focusing on that, because you can also get a lot of confidence from it. Knowing that you fueled, according to the latest recommendations from science and runners, I think it gives you a lot of confidence waking up in the morning going, yeah, like I've done all my training, I've fueled really well, I'm just kind of ready to go. There's nothing really else you can do. So that'll probably be the thing that I'd focus on, just as like the biggest driver in that, right before marathon, is just get your fuel 100% right the 2 days before.
With a carb load, what recommendations can you give for people? And even if they should carb load, I've actually heard someone say, oh, it's been debunked.
Mm-hmm. I'd probably argue that. So I would say definitely carb load, based on all of the evidence that I've seen. I would say like a 2-day carb load is probably like the best. And historically, like people talk about, carb loading for the whole week. I don't think that's necessary. I think a lot of the research has like moved away from that. I would aim for somewhere between 6 to 10 grams per kg of body weight. And again, I'll let you do the pounds to kg conversion. But as an example, a 60 kg runner would eat somewhere between 360 and 600 grams of carbs in both days before. So 6 to 10 grams on a Friday, on a Saturday, and then race day Sunday. Now, if you haven't ever tracked calories or food intake, that is 100% more than you think. And it's not grams of the food, like it's not 100 grams of pasta is equivalent in carbs, it's the carbohydrate gram equivalent. So it's a lot more than you think. And personally, and even just athletes I've worked with, liquid carbs are definitely your friend in those 2 days leading into a carb load. One, it's lower fiber, but also it doesn't fill you up as much. And so it's, funnily enough, it's like the 2 days of carb loading are the complete opposite advice I would give to somebody eating for like health reasons. I like the advice is, eat excessive amount of carbs, high sugar, low fiber, low protein, like no vegetables. And so it's honestly the complete opposite. But in the context of preparing for a marathon, I think that's the general advice is somewhere between 6 to 10 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight.
Yeah, it's always like mentally like jarring to try and do a bit of a carb load. One thing I do wonder is to your point about liquid carbs. So liquid carbs higher in sugar and that faster digesting carb. Is there any downside to having a lot of that? Because let's say it's a Friday race on a Sunday, it's sugar that's going to be fast absorbed into the bloodstream versus having, a slower digesting carb, for example. Is there a downside to having that fast digesting sugar?
I think I wouldn't only eat or drink those sort of like juices or sugary drinks, but there's no downside, because I think in the context, particularly, people will say like, oh, it's not healthy. I think in the context of like someone preparing for a marathon, you have to remember that like this type of like carb loading, one, it's balanced with an equivalent, output or like energy expenditure. So, someone training for a marathon is training a lot. And so their carbohydrate requirement goes up. And so I think, and also it's 2 days out of, a whole year, maybe 4 days if you do 2 marathons a year. And so in the grand scheme of things, like I don't think anyone has to be fearful of that. But certainly I'd be looking for like a bit of a mix of carbohydrate types for sure in those 2 days. But if you can combine drinking some juices and carbohydrate with eating, I think that's kind of like the main principle to focus on versus getting too worried about, because it's just hard to achieve the same level of carb intake if you don't use liquids, in my experience.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of maybe an 80-20 rule where you're doing 80% slow digesting, 20% faster digesting, just to make the last 20% a bit easier. So
yeah, it depends as well, because some of the slow digesting carb sources have higher fiber, and that's typically something that I'm trying to cut out as well. So there are some other like things to think about as well. I like in those 2 days I try to eat as little fiber as possible, and so that's tough obviously, because a lot of other slow digesting carb sources do have fiber in them.
Great. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that point. So yeah, my plan is like Gatorade, rice, and other bits. What's your recommendation for a carb load, if you have any just kind of go-to foods?
I find, well, it depends if you're like traveling as well. I find like rice pudding is amazing, and it's really easy to get in like any store. It's pretty cheap, like the little pots, and I find it goes down like really easy. Like I can eat, I think the day before, or in the 2 days, I probably ate like 8 to 10 little tubs of rice pudding. But also I traveled like for it, so I don't have like my own kitchen and store, so I have to go somewhere to like stock up on something. So that I tend to go with some juice, and then some of the carb drinks that people are using during events you can use sort of the day or two before as well. I personally wouldn't like use gels, because I just think you get sick of eating them. I'd save them for the race. Like I had 2 gels before the marathon, just the morning of, because we had to go in so early before the event, and that's a nice way to top up like fast digesting carbs. You can throw in your pocket, just take them really quickly, throw the wrapper in the bin. And I just that was at the point where I'd just been training for so long with marathons. I fueled my training like really, really well, and I was like, I can't wait to not have a gel for a couple of weeks after this marathon.
Yeah, it's funny, the advertising and marketing makes like a Morton gel look like so appealing, and like, oh, Kipchoge uses this or whatever, and it's like, yeah, it's not sexy and fun to have a gel for weeks on end. One other question that comes to mind is, so let's say someone, not me, but let's say somebody is a chronically poor sleeper, and then they're carb loading, and then they're also like, oh yeah, I'm just going to cram in 16 hours, Friday night, and if somehow you manage to pull this off the Saturday night before, is that enough to like bring the body back to like a good place, or is it just the damage is kind of done with like being a chronically poor sleeper and you can't get the best out of yourself just by getting 2 nights of good sleep before a race?
I mean, it certainly won't hinder it. I think it'll help if you can get an extra bit of sleep in the kind of week or two leading up to an event. The chronic low sleep is probably more affecting your adaptation to your training versus like the race day performance, because I'd imagine somebody's going to take a little bit of caffeine, really well fueled. They're the things you can control. So more so my concern for that type of person or that persona would be, they're probably just not getting as the most out of their training, because the sleep will support the adaptation. Athletes can perform exceptionally well on one night of low sleep before a marathon, and this will happen to a lot of people. You have to get up so early. People do travel in for these events, and you might only have 5 hours versus 8 normally, and that's fine. And I've seen ultra runners win races at crazy times on 4 hours of sleep. That's just what it is. You see this happen in NBA. Elite players travel, they play 2 games, 2 days in a row, and they travel from one place to the other. They're poor sleep. The game is, late at night or in the evening, and then, they're probably not getting to sleep until 2, 3 a.m. They're still able to perform at a high level. So it's the adaptation, the recovery process more so that I'd be concerned about. But if anybody does want to guarantee a little bit more sleep before a marathon, Dublin is a great one because it's the weekend of the clocks.
So getting the Friday, Saturday, 8 hours. And then you were just saying about Dublin Marathon, clocks. Yeah, I actually had we ran the same day, because I had a half marathon the same day, and same thing happened, and I was like, oh, this is great.
So for Dublin, that's a great one because you guarantee the extra hour of sleep, and I ended up sleeping a little bit more than I would typically. I didn't have to feel like I was rushing to get up in the morning because I had the extra hours. So if anybody does want that, I don't know if there's any other marathons on the exact same weekend as that, or the exact same weekend as clocks going back, but that's a little hack if anybody wants a little boost.
And the inverse is also true as well. If there's any race the day the clocks go forward, you're going to lose an hour. So that's probably a harder one as well. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah.
So Peter, something I tell myself is that elite athletes are elite sleepers as well. You've worked with Leinster, Chelsea, a bunch of different pros. How true is that? How true is it that elite athletes are also elite at sleeping and also recovery?
I don't know if it's as blanket true as you think. Definitely they will be consistent with sleep, and a lot of them, just because they're physically tired, will be able to sleep. But it doesn't mean that they're the most consistent people. I actually shared this a while ago on socials, and I'll have to share it and post it again, but I shared data from 4 different people. I think all from Oura Ring, and it was total sleep time. And it was 2 males, 2 females, and 2 of the athletes, there's 2 people were professional athletes and 2 were sort of general population, everyday athlete. And I asked people to guess which people were the professional athletes, and they guessed the 2 people that were general population. Because general population in that sample were actually sleeping more consistently and better than elite athletes. And the thing about elite athletes and professional athletes is they have to contend with schedules and travel and late competitions, and maybe not specifically for marathon as such, but if you think of NBA, soccer, football, rugby, all of the different sports, any other sport where they're traveling a lot for competition, that's going to play havoc and challenge their sleep. So it definitely is individual. I would say in general, though, they appreciate the need for sleep, and athletes are probably better nappers than most people because their schedules probably allow it. So if they don't sleep enough at night, they tend to be able to get an extra 45 minutes to an hour. And then there were some athletes I've worked with. There was a guy who worked in rugby who, at the time, we were doing quite an intense preseason, and he put on, his strength improvement was just crazy through the preseason. He put on loads of muscle mass, was getting fitter and faster, everything trended upwards. And I sort of had a conversation. I was just look, most of our athletes are improving, but your level of improvement is large. What are you doing? And he was I'm sleeping 10 hours a night. That was during the preseason. He was sleeping so much. He was just, and so that was obviously helping. And if he was nailing his nutrition, he was doing everything right. But that's an N=1 case study of probably the evidence for someone at with such a high training load, supporting that with high sleep and high recovery and good nutrition, and that paying off. So I don't know if it's a blanket statement, I'd say. But I do think now, and probably now with education and insight around sleep and the importance of improving, I think athletes are some of the populations that can, dedicate the time to it. But they're also a population that, carry a lot of stress and anxiety with performance. Some football players, every game, every week, 2 games a week, they're traveling, and they're scrutinized by every single thing that they do. And if there's a small error, that can weigh on them quite a bit. After a game, but also before a game, the sort of anxiety about if I make a mistake, people online are going to start slagging my family, that really does happen. So there are definitely some extreme cases where it's really hard for professional athletes to sleep well.
Yeah, I read, I think it was Paul O'Connell's autobiography, and he was saying that before a game he would like get sick, and it's just the nerves. He'd be racked with nerves, like, you know, he would put so much pressure on himself. I know that's an extreme example because your source of income comes from your performance, but yeah, they don't have it easy. And just mentioning the sleep and napping, and my watch will recommend I do like a breath work sometimes, and I'm always kind of just like, oh sure, what's that going to do? But would you be an advocate for, you know, naps, or even, you know, I know Huberman would recommend like non-sleep deep rest, getting like some meditation in. Do you think that, especially in the final weeks leading up to a marathon, like for a taper, naps and more meditation will help boost recovery?
The naps definitely, because I think for the most part, people need a little bit more sleep than they're probably getting. So a great strategy, if you have the time and the schedule to get a little nap in during the day, like fantastic. I also do think some of the, like, you know, the non-sleep deep rest or the meditation periods, like, I think they're really good to do during the day, just because they act, and I use this term for something else earlier on in our discussion, but they act as like a little bit of a circuit breaker or like a break in the day. And if anything, so I think, like, you know, breath work or the non-sleep deep rest or any sort of meditation, anything that just acts as a bit of a circuit breaker throughout the day can definitely help with just reducing the overall, like, accumulation of stress throughout a day. So it certainly can help. I think also some of the meditation pieces and the cognitive relaxation strategies can definitely help people that are more stressed, you know, and so everyone again will be a little bit different, and people probably get bored of me saying that, that like it depends on the individual, but, you know, there's an element of, like, people that believe in certain strategies find those strategies more effective, and that's, you know, there's some decent research on that as well, even from like an ice bath perspective. But layered alongside that is like the education around those strategies, because if there's really good evidence for a strategy across multiple different populations, but a person doesn't believe in it, that's an education challenge. And so that's where hopefully, like, you know, someone like yourself, a coach, myself, practitioners, people online can educate people on some of the benefit of some of these strategies. And then there's always an experience piece as well, where people just have to try some of these things. So, you know, my recommendation, you know, if someone in the last couple of weeks before is like, yeah, if you have time to nap, definitely nap and get that in. But if you want to try experiment with a meditation or mindfulness on, particularly on the days that you're like very busy, or you've got maybe a double workout, you're trying to squeeze it in on top of like family, work, travel, all the other pieces, like definitely worth trying, because I do think, and particularly worth trying right before you go to bed, because a lot of the benefit, or again, the anecdote that for people that I've spoken to is like it helps them fall asleep faster, and it helps them be a little bit more relaxed. It also gets them off their phone and stops them scrolling and like working and stuff. So I think that's a good opportunity if you do want to try some of those kind of meditation, breathwork, mindfulness pieces, is like right before you go to sleep.
Yeah, I love that. Anything that could boost the depth of the sleep or the quality of sleep would be huge. Peter, is there any supplements or recovery tools that people are almost abusing or overusing that are not effective based on the research, or that they could use more of? For example, I started using beetroot juice, and there's a little bit of research on it, but I know that it's not like a must. So yeah, any supplements or recovery tools that you highly recommend, or you're trying to dissuade people from using? Yeah,
like something like you said, beetroot is an example, or nitrates can definitely be effective. There's also some now like around like mushrooms, nootropics that can support. I think though, like, again, those things are really useful if you have the more foundational things in place. And so I would say, in my experience, like, before even thinking about those, most people just probably aren't even eating enough carbohydrate and probably aren't getting enough protein in. So I would start there. Like, I would start, and I say that even from supplements. Use the gels and the drinks you can get from different companies. Use the protein powders, because it is hard to get enough protein in. And particularly when you're training for marathon, your training load and volume is so high. Those two macros in particular, and definitely eat no fat, but those two in particular are going to really help with like fueling performance and recovery, and actually helping you adapt to the training you're doing. So I would start with those as like, just, you know, they're so convenient now. They're, again, pretty accessible in terms of price. And then start to think about things like, you know, even like for general health, like creatine, omegas. And then if you have all of those things in place, certainly there is a place for things like beetroot or nitrates as well. But it's not the first, you know, place that I start. You know, if someone asks you, like, what supplement should I take? It's usually like, well, let me have a look at your training first and make sure you're doing enough, or like, let's see if you're sleeping properly. And I guess the same principle for the recovery strategies. Like, all these tools can be really effective if you are sleeping enough. And, if you need to address a specific problem that they support, I think it's like really good. And like, if you think of things like heat or like even pneumatic compression, Normatec, I think they're a really good tool. And it's something that I've prescribed to a lot of people and athletes who have access to them. But if you're doing the Normatec, but it's instead of sleeping an extra hour, or you're staying up later to do it, I don't know if that's like the best thing. But certainly, like, I use them in a build for myself, for a 50k, like a trail race. And because I was doing a bit more like, I guess, like hill work or strength work, like I just had like sore legs quite often, and they were really helpful for that. And because of the convenience of them, and for a lot of athletes who just want some sort of active strategy, but also want to be on, like, play games or chatting to their friends, whatever it is, or sitting around, that can be quite a good strategy in that situation. And even for a practitioner, if you're in an environment, a gym facility or a training ground where you have access to a few of these different tools, it's a really good chance to get to have a conversation with an athlete as well. So like, if someone's sitting in a Normatec and it's helping their recovery, and you also get to learn a little bit about other behaviors, that's a nice sort of like dual benefit, I guess, to that situation. And, when I was training for the trail race and the marathon, I'd use the opportunity when I was in the Normatec to like update my training, or like have a look at what was coming up tomorrow, and sort of use that time as like sort of like, again, like I said, dual benefit to support my like overall training. So, but yeah, all of those like supplements and recovery tools, really useful, definitely, particularly if you're someone who has symptoms in certain things, but not at the expense of the sort of foundational behaviors.
Peter, the first thought that comes to mind is you'd make a bad snake oil salesman. You got the fundamentals drilled in, and you're like, you're not wavering, which is, I love to hear that, because a part of me wants to like be told, oh yeah, actually you want to triple your beetroot juice and the sleep will be grand. And it's like, no, it doesn't work like that at all. So
now,
yeah.
The other caveat I'll say, my pitch to be a snake oil salesman is sometimes things like, let's sleep, okay, for example, and like supplements. Sometimes, so the sleep duration is the most important part, and supplements can support. But sometimes the supplements can actually act as like a catalyst to improve sleep. Obviously, from an ingredient point of view, but I mean also from like a behavioral or like a process point of view. And so sometimes, in some cases, the people, a supplement is the place to start. It's usually not, generally not, but sometimes it is, because it acts as an anchor to go, okay, an hour before you go to sleep, you're going to take the supplement, but it's also going to be the start of the moment where you get off your phone, you stop working, where you have a shower, wind down, you read a book, and so it can be built into that sort of like routine. And you could say the same thing for supplements for running. If someone's like, I want to buy these like expensive gels, I think we'll do it, because if it means you're getting sufficient carbohydrate across your whole day, if the gels are the avenue for you to meet your caloric needs, bingo, that's like your way in as well. So that's my salesman pitch.
Yeah, it could actually be kind of like an identity-based, like behavior change approach, where like, for example, okay, Ross, now you're having the beetroot juice because you're ramping things up. And symbolically, this means now that like it's the closing stages, and it's like, this is a cascade effect of, okay, you're going to reprioritize, you're talking to Peter, right? You're going to reprioritize your sleep now, and you're going to try the Normatec boots as well, or actually the sleep is what I should be focusing on, but keeping it simple. It's powerful, like the symbolism behind these. I guess it's just like, you have to know why you're doing the things you're doing.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So you've worked with a bunch of, high-level athletes and sports teams. Is there any particularly significant event you've prepared a team or an athlete for that's taught you about how to prepare for a big event?
Yeah, good question. And there's probably a few, like across a few different environments. So depending on how quickly I speak as an Irish person, you'll appreciate, but also how much time we have. I'm happy to maybe give a couple.
Sure.
I think, like if I think of one in rugby, when you're preparing for like, European Cup or that type of competition, one of the things I noticed, and it was really hard to like quantify, but there was definitely like an energy shift in the building or in the facility, where at Leinster where I was working, there was always this like elevation of like focus and energy and mood and determination. And these are all words I'm using that I haven't measured, but around those like those cup games. And the weeks always carried this like, it was like almost a level of anxiety and even a little bit of like tension, because we knew the importance of those games. So I think like in preparing for those competitions, you've got to like acknowledge that there are some things that you just can't measure, or are very, very difficult to measure. in the lead ups to sort of key events. And I think the learning from that is across any sport, even for a marathon, for example, there will definitely be a level of anxiety or tension or even maybe energy that a lot of people feel in the week leading up to it, because that's what you've been training for a long time. And it's sort of like acknowledging it and being okay with, okay, yeah, like, I'm probably going to feel a bit different this week. There's nothing wrong with that. That probably means I'm just excited for the event that's coming. So that's like one. I think the other examples are probably around like some of the time I spent in international football, where you're going away to competition, you're playing 3 games in 8 days, and the turnaround. So you play a game, you've got the day after, which is a combination of like a recovery day and a training day for some of the players that didn't play, and then you've got the next day is a training day, and then you play the following day. And so that's so dense in terms of fixtures that that's a real big challenge in terms of like preparing athletes for, but also coaches, because coaches just want to train all the time because they need to get like tactical information across. And then, there's a conversation of the balance of trying to reduce physical load and stress on a player to recover so they're ready for the next game, but also making sure that they're sufficiently prepared. So that's a challenge, and that's an ongoing challenge in most sports now, where the intensity of competition is increasing, the density of fixtures is increasing. Like I saw the stat, I love basketball, and I saw the Warriors at the start of this NBA season have had I think it's like 17 games in 29 or 28 days across like 13 different, whatever. And their head coach, Steve Kerr, had said, it's one of the most intense schedules he's ever been a part of in NBA in all of his years in the competition. So, that's happening across multiple sports. So I think that's an event in itself to prepare for. It's like it's just the competition. And then the other one that probably springs to mind is like in Lululemon, I was part of the company, we had such a huge amount of people involved in this, but the event that we put on called Further, and Further was a 6-day ultramarathon event that we put on for 10 female runners. And there was just so much to consider for like preparing for that event for the ambassadors. Now, this was also for everybody involved in the event and the company and all the things around it, the research supporting it from externals. But there's just so much into it. And when you do an event like that, that's you build towards, for 2 years, you really see all of the things you have to consider and all of the voices that it takes and the people that it takes to actually have a successful event, because everyone will look at it from like a different perspective. And you need to be, as a performance coach or a designer or whatever position you hold, or a physio or anything, depending on the context, you just need to be able to get your point across, because if you're too afraid to say something like that, then, something might miss across the whole event. So that's definitely one that was just so unique for me and for us, I think, as a company to put on. And for the athletes to train for that. Yeah, there's just, I think across all of those things though, the main thing I take from it is like how holistic performance is, that it's not just about like one thing. It's not just about like nutrition. It's not just about like training. There are psychological components. There's all of the other things that go into like getting to a marathon day, or, preparing for a football or a soccer match. And people handle things very differently as well. So speaking to a friend of yours, they might feel completely different to you in the lead up to a marathon, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that you've done something wrong. You've just got to acknowledge that their situation is maybe different to yours. But I think you can sort of, if you anchor yourself across like maintaining some sort of routine and good energy and good moods in those periods of like really high stress, that tends to help people get through a lot of that sort of like, changing perspectives. But yeah, I just think the holistic nature of all of those things definitely gives a lot of perspective around how much it takes to go into like any sort of performance.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I'll wrap up after this, but it reminds me of a friend who was doing a half marathon, and the longest long run they'd done was 5 miles. Because I knew he would be all right to do it, that came across in our conversation the night before, but he was calling me to basically pull out. And I was like, yeah, when you finish, you're going to feel amazing. Like the accomplishment you get is like nothing else. And then I kind of tricked him, or got him to believe that he could do it. And he said afterwards, he was like, I was out, but Ross thought I could do it. So then I was like, well, maybe I can do it. And then he did it, and it worked out. And people forget that you can walk. like they think they have to run the whole thing. So yeah, that kind of social support, or like just a coach even, is huge. But Peter, we have to wrap up. That was great, and I really appreciate your time. Do you want to just let people know any final points, or about where they can hear more about all the great work you do?
Yeah, I don't have any final points. I think there's always loads to unpick. So like probably chat for hours and all of this, and you can go in so many different directions around running specifically for marathon, but like any distance or any sort of like performance event. There's so much like carryover to health and fitness and everything. So we could probably chat for hours, like we were even saying just before you jumped on. You can go on so many different tangents and it still be relevant and hopefully useful and interesting for people to listen to and hopefully learn a few things from. Mostly I'm posting on like Instagram, and that's probably the place that I'm like most active, and I get a lot from that selfishly myself as well. Like I tend to share a lot of things out and get feedback on them from peers and my network, and that will help evolve whatever resource that is. So for example, I've shared out some graphs around like different carbohydrate gels or different recovery strategies and different things, and of course I'm human, it's me making them, I'll forget something, or the science evolves or the evidence evolves or people's experiences are different, and as long as people give me some constructive feedback, I'll always take it on board. And you'll see with some of my graphics and content that they're on like different versions. So like, there might be a version 4 or 5. And that's because over the last 2 years, I've taken feedback from people and sort of like tried to produce something better, because things always evolve and change. So that's probably the place that's easiest to like contact me. And from there, if anybody wants to speak about like coaching or working with their brand or company or whatever it might be, then that's probably the easiest place just to go to have one place to go to, and then I can help direct them from there.
Yeah, I can't recommend Peter's content enough. It's really easy to understand and some really high quality science on there. So check out his Instagram, and I'll attach that in the show link. Thanks very much, Peter.
Awesome. Thanks, Ross, for having me and for the conversation.